In the 19th century, Canada was dependent on Britain for law, arts, and culture. But as Canadian society grew, so did its capacity in the arts. A milestone in Canadian national identity was reached in the 1920s. With the introduction of an art movement spearheaded by the landscape painters later known as the Group of Seven. As such, the Group of Seven is a keystone of Canadian art canon. That standing could be under threat, however, as the current of anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion washes through Canadian institutions. A small movement is seeking to unseat the Group of Seven from its place in Canadian history, and the National Gallery of Canada appears to be sympathetic. Why? Because the Group of Seven, which largely painted vast landscapes of the Canadian wilderness, supposedly had white supremacist elements. Specifically, an illustration by a Group of Seven member appeared in a magazine beside a racist article. And because a supporter and friend of the group once signed a petition that called for a stop to black immigration to Canada. This charge of white supremacy comes from artist Tiana Bowen, whose work is currently being featured on the south facade of the National Gallery in Ottawa. Bowen's two-story mural uses archival images to visually document a history of anti-black racism in Canada. Its name, The Black Canadians After Cook, is a reference to a Maclean's magazine article published in 1911, titled, The Black Canadian, which was authored by a man named Britton B. Cook. Racist claims were made throughout the article, with Cook concluding that black people are unsuited to the development of the highest sort of citizenship in Canada. At the mural's center is a cutout of a negative photograph depicting a black boy, which was used to illustrate the article in question. Appearing elsewhere on the mural are images of Ku Klux Klan members, the Prime Minister attending the Nazi-hosted Berlin Olympics, the Group of Seven, and a number of black Canadians. In the same issue of Maclean's, on the page before but unrelated to the racist article in question, ran a pencil sketch of an under-construction skyscraper by Group of Seven member Lauren Harris, who wouldn't have had editorial control over the placement of his work. Just because a Maclean's editor decided to put an illustration in the opening pages of that particular issue of the magazine doesn't mean the artist was endorsing the rest of the issue's content. Still, Bowen draws a connection. The companion illustration is by Lauren Harris, Bowen said of the Maclean's article in a video produced by the National Gallery, which confusingly does not show the illustration in question. And so, it's important to name the article, which effectively frames us all as being lazy, ignorant slaves, former slaves with no upkeep and no hygiene and all the stuff. And we would just basically loiter around and not work. What does it mean if Lauren Harris's image is married to this filth article? Harris's image, in fact, appears to be a married to but adrift from an article in the subsequent issue, where a series of his pencil illustrations of Toronto were included in a feature story about growth and change in Canadian cities. What appears to have happened is that the editors ran one of those images early, a detail missed by the National Gallery's promotional video. Further incrimination arises from a photo, also reproduced on Bowen's mural, of Barker Fairley, an art critic and professor at the University of Toronto. Fairley signed a 1911 petition to limit the admission of black people into Canada. While no Group of Seven members joined him in signing the petition, the fact that Fairley promoted them implies some kind of racist connection, according to Bowen. Guilt by association. Criticism has ensued. A column in Le Journal de Montréal warned readers that the National Gallery, with its new south facade, would seek to remind white viewers that they are racists, supremacists and imperialists. Former longtime senior curator Charles Hill called the work a screed. He is concerned about the lack of rigor in Bowen's historical arguments. The gallery doesn't have a responsibility to preserve the reputation of any group or movement, Hill told the National Post. We have a responsibility to preserve the collections, and a responsibility of truth to the collections. To slam the history and slam the history of our predecessors is just irresponsible. Responding to criticism, the National Gallery released a statement at the end of June, describing the claim that Bowen's mural links the Group of Seven with white supremacy as untrue and misleading. Bowen includes images of members of the Group of Seven in her work because they were contemporaries of the people and events that impacted her family, explained the gallery's statement. As an artist, Bowen also situates her work in reference to the site and location in which a project is exhibited, in this case the National Gallery of Canada. Its collection and archive, hosting this installation is not a repudiation of these iconic artists. Within the context of The Black Canadians After Cook, the presence of the Group of Seven helps us to better understand Canada's history through what they and their artwork represented. In a further statement to me, the National Gallery explained that the placement of an innocuous drawing by a future group of 7 members beside a racist article in a magazine was indicative of the polarities that existed at this point in Canada's history. The idea, according to the gallery, is to place the dominant against the marginalized and to show the cultural and the political as being interconnected. Art is art, but did the National Gallery really need a giant mural implying a link between swastikas, the KKK and the Group of 7? In the gallery's eyes, there is no problem here. The artist is pointing to a particular incriminating conclusion about Canadian art history with the flimsiest of evidence. But that's fine. It's not up to the gallery to interfere. Artists should be able to make whatever art they like without interference. But as a storied government-run institution dedicated to preserving our visual history, the National Gallery has an obligation to be discerning in the type of art it chooses to display. In this case, curators have adorned the gallery with a dishonest work that appears historical despite using pseudo-historical methods. None of the Group of 7 is married to the 1910s anti-black immigration movement, regardless of how much the artist wants them to be. Perhaps this is the kind of historical revisionism we should expect from the gallery, whose new decolonization-oriented leadership team is more interested in deconstruction than preservation. If the National Gallery is contemplating the deaccession of the Canadian canon in the name of diversity, the Department of Canadian Heritage should contemplate bringing in leadership that values historical accuracy.